Get this started. All right, so for tonight, we'll have Ryan, the town administrator, talk about the town structure here in town. We'll also have some folks from our legal counsel talk about open meeting law. We'll also be talking about managing public comments. Peggy, our town clerk, will be talking about the volunteer onboarding. I'll touch briefly on HR policies because that does apply for anybody who has a staff member. And we'll also be talking about the appointment and resignation process. Jen will be managing that. And then we will also talk about finance, because most committees will have some sort of budget related item to manage. So Ryan, if you want to take over.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan McQueen. I'm the town administrator here in Carlisle. I've met a lot of you. And I just wanted to say, Aubrey did a great job putting this together. So she serves as a liaison to the boards and committees to the staff, meaning if you have staffing issues, or if you're trying to solve some type of IT problem, she's a conduit. So is Jen, my great assistant, who many of you have already made contact with or worked with Jen Given. So she put together all of the food that you're enjoying and the structure of this meeting. We do have a lot of staff and a lot of resources. So a lot of boards and committees ask for support, meaning they want help for this or that, or to understand these things. That's what we're here for. So we want our volunteers to make good decisions and have all the information they need to make the decisions, and to tell us how they want us to run the town, and then we execute that. So that is the basics of what we're trying to accomplish. So the point of this meeting is the brainchild of the master plan, some select board goals, trying to get board chairs and new volunteers connected to the information they need to be solid board and committee members and make good decisions for the town. So that's what tonight is about. So I want to talk first about some key documents and sources of information for you to do your own research, and then I'll talk a little bit about the town structure, which is important, where you fit in the world of Carlisle. So first we have the town website. I don't know if you can click it. If you want to scroll up to there it is. All right, so all of our departments, boards, and committees live in this area. Okay, if you want to find your board and committee, make sure your information is accurate. That's especially true for the chairs. Things like how many people are on your board, if vacancies are open. Those are important things that people ask us about all the time. Also, your agenda and minutes, making sure you get that to our very talented town clerk, so that we're compliant with the law and also providing as much information as possible. And then if you scroll down just a little bit, Aubrey. So you can sign up on our town website for news alerts. You can get agendas, you can get minutes. Anytime we post anything about jobs, if you want to connect to those, it's on Notify Me. And then we post regular news updates. We try not to flood it with junk. It's stuff that's really relevant, like town meeting and other important information. Do you want to click the bylaws? I think it's at your top, on the top there. Carlisle bylaws.
Oh, that's my tab.
So these are the general bylaws for the town. So a bylaw is something that does not interfere, and I'll get to this in a second, with the state constitution or the Massachusetts general laws. And it's something the town has said, this is how we exist and this is how we want you to operate, right? So your general bylaws. So your board and committee likely has bylaws that govern how you're supposed to interact, and then how the townsfolk have voted on how we do things here in Carlisle. So bylaws are important. So you should check this document to make sure what you're doing is consistent there. We'll get a little bit into personnel policies, so we can skip that, but that is how town staff is guided, and policies that have been approved by the town. And if you want to click on master plan.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's fairly basic and probably everybody knows this, but how frequently are your bylaws updated? And what would you have?
Okay, so you're gonna hear me say this a lot, and it's not meant in a negative way, but they're your bylaws. I don't have anything to do with them. I don't live here in Carlisle. So the bylaws can only be changed at town meeting. So you need a town meeting vote to even change a word in the bylaws themselves. So the only time that they can be changed is when a town meeting is coming up. So that can be done through a citizen petition, by asking an elected board to put a warrant article in through the select board and then deliberating in a town meeting. Right.
Having said that, we are committed now to reviewing. Like we're all, in any way. On its own, but through the. Voted.
Correct. Yeah, one of the big talking points in the board, the select board right now is how often to review bylaws and should they be refreshed every so often on a regular basis. So then we have the master plan. So the master plan is simply a strategic guiding document. This is something that town staff inherited from a public process that's 2 to 3 years long. It has 86 or 88 recommendations on how the town should focus itself for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we are incorporating this into our goals. The staff sees this as a guiding document, and boards and committees have been asked to align or to work on their sections of the master plan. So that doesn't mean that it's prescriptive, that every single word in there has to be followed to a T, but it is a, here's how we think the town should go, based off of conversations and kitchen tables, surveys, and a lot of work by a lot of dedicated volunteers like you. Back to the agenda, please. All right, and then another key source of information. So Aubrey, many of her jobs, she's the HR director. She is the primary contact for board and committee chairs and a staff liaison, and then also our communications director. So she works on social media and online presence. We do have a pretty decent following on Facebook, not so good on Twitter. I think that just changed to Threads, or there's 2 Instagram and then LinkedIn. And now we do post when we do not respond on City in the Woods for OML reasons and to not engage in some things, but it is a good place for people to go and get information. Then, as I said earlier, you can subscribe to the website to the things that you want to be notified. So a good example of that is, let's say there's this item that a resident wants to make sure that the select board isn't talking about because it's something that's really near and dear to them. They might register for the agenda for the select board. They'll get an email. They can look at the agenda and make sure their item hasn't appeared or has, if it's the other way around. Next slide, please. Okay, woo, this is the town structure. All right, so dark green is all of you and your friends and peers. That's Carlisle voters.
I thought it was you.
It's not me. I'm somewhere in this area. All right, so these are all of your elected officials and elected boards. Many of you serve on these. Okay, so you're voted in directly by Carlisle voters, and you are our bosses representing. Oh, Lynn's here. Okay, and these are just categories for understanding. So they're not actually in any bylaw or anything. It's just a way to categorize it for the select board. So these boards and committees come. All right, let me back up. The Massachusetts Constitution, written by John Adams, said that government would be structured this way in Massachusetts. Okay, all towns and cities have to incorporate within the framework of that Constitution, and then all of the general laws that have been laid on top of it. So, what does that mean for you? Carlisle is what we call a statutory town, meaning we fall under, unless we stated otherwise, and it's not conflicting, the way Mass General Law says we have to organize ourselves. All right, so what does that mean? If the select board and the town accepted a provision of Mass General Law to create something like the Council on Aging exists under the state law and then fine-tuned by the town. Okay, so the reason why the Council on Aging exists is because once upon a time, the voters in Carlisle said we want the Council on Aging as described by Massachusetts General Law. And that's true of Cultural Council, Conscom, and Associate Finance Committee, Recreation Committee, and that's it for there. So next, the select board then has the authority as the executives in town to create other boards and committees. Okay, some of them are required by state law or by function, and others are created because the town wanted to address something. So a great example of that is my good friend Tom Bellata and the Transfer Station Action Committee. So the transfer station needed some work and some organization. So a volunteer group was put together and said, hey, can you study this for a while on behalf of us and bring some recommendations? So the select board created them, charged them, and then can eventually fold them if they want to. What the select board has been talking about recently is, I'm sorry, these are all MGLs too. AgCom, Board of Registers, CPC, Zoning Board of Appeals. All right, so the other committees here, the select board has said They want to review all of their committees and structures to make sure they're all still relevant, charged correctly, and necessary. And then create new ones if they want. So an example I've been talking about is the cemetery might need some type of action committee or oversight at some point in order to address some issues with the transfer of authority from Gary to Jim, who's here, right? In that long time, that 40 years of work in the cemetery, we need to make sure that that's transferred and then re-looked at, make sure we're following modern practice. That's a lot. Any questions on that? So this is before we even get to staff. So this is you. Any questions on any of that? Why do you think Massachusetts spends so much on education?
Because the Constitution is so.
John Adams in the first, 3 sentences said education will be a priority in Massachusetts. It's literally why Massachusetts spends so much money on education. Other states, not so much. You can probably guess what they are. Next slide. So before I move on to this, and the rest of it is pretty quick. The structure of the town, so you'll hear some words as boards and committee members like bylaws, charter, right, or statutory bylaws. Those are ways that you can change the state law in order to allow Carlisle to be structured differently. A charter is nothing but a town document, like a constitution, that says, accepting all the federal and state laws that we can, here's how we want to organize. Okay, some people like that type of structure, some people prefer a decentralized structure. Carlisle swings towards a decentralized part where boards and committees have most of the authority and power, and then they use staff in order to execute that power. So how do they do that? Through departments and staff. So very flat, simple organization here in Carlisle. So anywhere where there's green, that means that board controls the appointment of that particular employee. Anyone who's not under a green bubble and arrow is controlled by the select board, and sometimes they delegate that authority to me. That's why I said I exist somewhere in the middle. All right. So here I am. I have authority only when given by the select boards to oversee many of the department heads that exist in town. Big exceptions include the fire chief. So Massachusetts has a general law that says police chiefs and fire chiefs can become what's called strong chiefs. So the select board would appoint that chief, and then that chief has the authority to do everything else, right? So the only person they answer to is the select board, and they have full fire, and control authority over their people. So very simply put, when you have this type of structure, my job is to make sure I'm coordinating with all those boards and committees and appointing authorities who often want more insight into the day-to-day, but do not want me messing with the long-term plan, right? So that's the trade-off between an executive, a strong executive, and elected officials. You'll hear a lot about that. It's an important discussion point. It's something I fully support. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Carlisle's a little quirky here. Our school committee, right? K through 8 is local school, regional high school. Usually you either have an all local school or an all regional school. We have both. So that's cool and fun to deal with. Next slide. It actually taught me a lot about school structure. And then real quick, here's our police department organization. No boards and committees there. Next slide. Fire department, as I said, we have a strong fire chief. We have what's called a weak police chief, but he does not love that term. Right, next slide. Here's Jim, now a director, not superintendent, under our public works. Next slide. Library, very interesting. So library trustees have full authority over the library. Why do people think that is? Why isn't library authority in someone like me or the select board? Keep it independent. For what reason?
Freedom of speech?
It's a really good guess. It's actually money.
Of money, okay.
So, so people like me, when there's a budget crunch, tend to think what would fire the most people up? Close the library, close the schools, or cut the funding, right? So libraries long ago got smart and said, you know what, we're gonna get our own authority under state law and run ourselves this way. So if we do cut the library budget by state statute, we lose a ton of state funding. So you're basically throwing away money if you do that, and they've organized themselves as such. So the library trustees, one of the most powerful boards in any community in Massachusetts. and they wield it well. We have a good library trustees here. Next slide.
Nope.
That's it.
Yeah.
So for me, on the structure side, why do I think this is important? I think it's important for you to understand how you were born, where you live in the structure of your birth, and how you can affect change in the community or not, or to keep things the same, and then how you can associate with the staff and how I play a role in there with the select board and other staff members. So I'd love if there's any questions on that.
It's a really quick one. It was actually my wife who wanted the answers going. Will we have access to that slide, especially the town structure?
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we will. And it does change as things change, but
Yeah.
we'll try to give you the most up to date. We also keep the most up to date version on the town website under human resources.
Excellent.
Any other questions? Okay, great. I'll turn it over to the lawyers, the most exciting part.
Thanks for the introduction. That's so true.
So this is Donna.
I'm Donna Brewer, Town Council's office. Nice to see you all.
And Ethan Dively, Associate Town Council.
So town council, real quick, in that structured conversation. And congratulations on your promotion, by the way.
Thank you.
I saw that. So town council, you could have a lawyer on staff, right? That would be, so city solicitor is a common name, or you can appoint a firm to represent the town. So this is our appointed town council. So they serve as an employee, but as a private contractor, which is a whole nother set of structures that I'm not gonna get to.
So good evening, everybody. I am going to give you a brief overview of the open meeting law, and then Ethan is going to talk about public records. So who does the open meeting law apply to? It applies to any board or committee. I don't care if you're elected. I don't care if you're appointed. It even applies to the Board of Library Trustees. However much power they have, they're still subject to this state law. This state law governs how you must run your meetings, how you must let the public know that you're holding a meeting, how you run your meeting, and then how the meeting is kept in, the record of that meeting is kept for the public going forward. So here we go. All public bodies, even subcommittees. You're the Zoning Board of Appeals. You want to appoint two of your members to look into zoning bylaw changes you might want to recommend for the next annual town meeting. That group of two is a subcommittee, and it must abide by the open meeting law. So there are educational requirements whenever you are first appointed or elected, or whenever you are re-elected or reappointed. The town clerk is going to give you information about the open meeting law, and you are going to have to sign a certificate saying that you got information about the open meeting law from the town clerk. It's going to include the open meeting law and regulations. There's a guide that is published by the state that's really helpful on educational materials. You're also going to get notice of any violations of the open meeting law that your public body has been cited for by the Attorney General's office in the last 5 years. And you will sign the certificate and it gets filed with the town clerk, who then provides that to the state. All meetings of a public body must occur during a posted and noticed meeting. Really important. There are some minor exceptions we may not get time for. Oh, actually, we will address it in a later slide. Next one. So what is a meeting? A meeting is a deliberation by a quorum of a public body with respect to any matter within the body's jurisdiction. And again, there are certain express exceptions. As a general matter, if a quorum, and a quorum is defined as a majority of your board. If you are a 5-member board, your quorum is 3. So if 3 of you get together at a cocktail party and start talking about the next subdivision application that's coming before you, that is a deliberation. It's outside of a posted meeting, and you are committing an open meeting law violation. So what's not a meeting? An on-site inspection, provided there are no deliberations, and I cannot stress this enough. I'm going to tell you to post your on-site inspections anyway. Usually this comes up with somebody like with a board like the Conservation Commission, which is going to do a site visit to confirm the delineation of the wetlands. They can go on site. They don't have to post it beforehand. The public isn't going to be there so long as they do not deliberate. That means do not be asking questions and engaging in a back and forth with the landowner. You do that, you're committing an open meeting law violation. So an attendance by a quorum at an event, provided again, there are no deliberations, that's not going to be a meeting. And by that you could go, let's go back to the cocktail party. All 5 of you are there at the cocktail party. You are talking about the 4th of July celebration. That's fine. That's not going to be a meeting. Attendance by a quorum at a meeting of another public body, provided no deliberations. Again, the select board is having a meeting going on and there's members of the Council on Aging who want to see what the select board is going to talk about. They can go. A quorum or the full membership of the Council on Aging can go, just so long as they don't start talking with one another about something that is within the Council on Aging's jurisdiction. And then town meeting itself, everybody gets to attend town meeting. That's not a public meeting for the purposes of the open meeting law.
Donna,
Mm.
or on-site inspections, or the public allowed to come to them?
So typically not. You need the permission of the landowner if it's going to be on private property. So that may be why you're not going to have a meeting, but again, you got to remember not to engage in the back and forth asking questions. So what is a deliberation? I've been using that word a lot. And a deliberation is simply any oral or written communication through any medium, including email, between or among a quorum of a public body on any public business within its jurisdiction. Again, this is where a lot of open meeting law complaints come in, a lot of violations, because board members will start communicating with one another by email. They'll start by just discussing the agenda, which you can do, which we're going to get to, and then they'll start talking about what they want to say at the meeting about the agenda item, and then you've gone too far. Then you're committing an open meeting law violation. So what is not a deliberation? The sub-quorum, if it's not a subcommittee. Again, if you can assign, what I'd say for this one, just ignore it, because you're going to probably set up a subcommittee. If the board or committee votes to set up a smaller group to discuss something, it's going to be a subcommittee. The distribution of the meeting agenda, scheduling, or procedural information, I just alluded to that a little bit. You can communicate by email, by phone, in person with one another about saying, you know, I really want to be able to discuss the upcoming 4th of July event and what the Council on Aging should do as part of that. You can talk about that and say, yeah, let's put that on for the May 30th meeting, whatever. How the scheduling goes, that is, let's put this item last on the agenda and we'll put this other item on first. That's okay. Procedural information about, you know, sorry, yeah.
No, it's okay. I wanted you to continue, but because I just wanted clarification on the 3rd bullet point.
Okay,
Because there isn't anything that references no deliberations as there were in any other gathering, you know, of a quorum. So.
you mean about the distribution of the report?
Document.
We're gonna get to that next, because this
Okay.
is a really tricky part. And I gotta tell you, the state attorney general's office has not settled on what their opinion is on this. So if you're gonna trip up any boards and committees, you're gonna do it in this. So what the current state of the law is, and why don't we go to that slide? This is file sharing and collaboration is what we're talking about. Again, let's go back to the zoning board of appeals. They have a request for a variance before them. They've had the meeting. They're now going to be discussing what the decision is going to say. That is, you know, how it's going to be written up. Are you going to grant the variance? If you're not going to grant the variance, here's the reasons why. If you are going to grant it, again, same thing. What's it going to say? A recent case from the Supreme Judicial Court, which is the highest court in the Commonwealth, decided that you could share a marked up version of that decision with the other board members, and the other board members can send their comments back once to, let's say, the chair of the ZBA. And if you do that, the SJC said, that's okay, that's not going to be an open meeting law violation. The Attorney General has indicated, yeah, we're not sure we agree with the court. So at the moment, if you look on the Attorney General's website for their frequently asked questions, you'll see something that will indicate that this is okay. What we're getting now are decisions back from the AG, mainly in oral communications with us when we call for advice, saying, yeah, no, don't do that. So what they're saying instead is, and you certainly don't want to get into Google Docs because it's so easy then to start communicating and sending various drafts. And before you know it, you've got 3 versions and you violated the open meeting. What we recommend is that you share a marked up version with everybody. And then you schedule just a short meeting. It's going to be remote because that's easiest for everybody to do now. So schedule a short Zoom meeting just to exchange draft documents. You're going to do all the things you need to do to get that meeting posted and in compliance with the open meeting law. But its only purpose is going to be to share back and forth your views, your edits to whatever the draft document is. I'm going to tell you, if you don't do that, pretty soon you're going to be getting into exchanging drafts and you're going to have an open meeting law violation.
Question if I may.
Of course.
When it comes to minutes, and if there's amendments to minutes,
Mhm.
do we still have to do that, or can we still do the, send it out to everybody, then the minute taker receives everyone's input, and then before the meeting, she just sends it out to everybody to be voted on in the meeting?
The SJC tells you can do that. So the Attorney General isn't so sure anymore. So what I would recommend in that case is that if somebody has edits, and this does even actually happen independent of the Volcker decision by the SJC, is the minutes will be presented to the board. They've seen the draft minutes, and then you'll have people say, you know what, I really think this doesn't accurately describe what we talked about. I'd like to see that changed. The board is there. They can vote on whether to amend the minutes. They go back, and then at the next meeting, you'll approve the amended minutes. So that's what I'd recommend that you do. But just be aware that if it doesn't go that way, you still have an argument that you haven't violated the open meeting law. Before you can hold a meeting, you have to post notice of the meeting. You have to do that at least 48 hours in advance. It excludes weekends and holidays. So if you're going to have a meeting Monday night, you cannot go to Peggy and say, post our meeting on Friday morning. You better do it on Thursday because it excludes weekends and holidays. Now, what does a meeting notice have to include? It's got to include the location. If there's going to be remote access, then you have to include the link, the information for the public to access it, as well as the time of the meeting. You have to include in the notice your agenda items. That is the topics that the chairman of the board or committee reasonably anticipates to be addressed at the meeting. I think I'll get into the content of that, but it's got to be sufficiently detailed to advise the public on what the topic is. If the executive session is your only topic, let's say somebody filed an open meeting law complaint against your committee. You're at the Board of Health, you don't meet that often, but you want to meet to discuss the open meeting law complaint, which you have to do. You would then post a meeting. The executive session to discuss that complaint is going to be your only topic. But then in that case, your agenda has to specifically say you're first going to open in an open session, and then you vote to go into executive session. So if in that case, you need to note specifically you're going to go into open session first. If you have a mixture on your agenda of open and executive session items, then you don't have to do that. But this is just if the executive session is the only topic. Next. Meeting notices and agendas typically get posted on town hall. If they're only posted at town hall, then they've got to be publicly available 24/7. someplace, usually, and it used to be before the websites really got going, people would have the little TVs that would be out a window so somebody could see them. Right now, I suspect, Ryan, that the official posting place is the website. Is it?
Yes, it
Peggy?
is.
Yeah.
Yes.
So right now, the website is your official posting place. Of course, that notice is going to be there 24/7. Even if the website is your official posting place, you still need to have the notice posted outside the town clerk's office or in the town clerk's office, so that the public can see it during normal business hours. The minutes, written minutes are required. We now know with a whole lot of meetings being held remotely, a whole lot of them are being recorded. It is not sufficient to just hold on to the video and say that's going to constitute our minutes. You need written minutes. What do the minutes have? The minutes are not a transcription of everything that's said at a meeting. I can't stress this enough. We do not need to know every single thing that was said. What you do need to have is the time, the date, the place, and the members who are present. The members who are participating remotely have to be identified. You need to have sufficient detail in your minutes to reasonably advise individuals who are not at the meeting what transpired at the meeting. And then you need to have a record in the minutes of the decisions made, actions taken, including the record of each vote. And you have to list in your minutes any documents or other exhibits that are used at the meeting. You don't have to attach a copy of all those documents that are used at the meeting, but you do need to list them so that they can be identified so that a member of the public can ask for them. So when do you approve the minutes? For open sessions, that means not executive session meetings. You approve them within 30 days or within 3 meetings, whichever comes later. I said, like the example of the Board of Health doesn't meet that often. Let's say it meets once every 3 months. They don't have to come back for a special meeting just to approve the minutes. Are the minutes a public record? Yes, as well as the documents that are used at the meeting. Limited exceptions that we won't go into here. Executive session is very much the same, except that they're not going to be automatically public records. So you approve them on the same schedule. You will release them. You have to review them every so often. So you review executive session minutes every 3 months to determine whether the reasons why you went into executive session still remain, to keep the record of that meeting confidential. If they are, then you keep them confidential and review them again. And once you vote them to release them to the public, then they're going to be public record. Yeah.
Essential question about doing minutes. If during the course of a meeting, images are shown, let's say, for example, we're discussing the memory box. Is that required to be in the meeting minutes, or is it just a summary? I'm just curious about that.
You mean the actual image itself does not need to be in the minutes?
Okay.
Just a description of, shown thing. Now, it may be, the problem arises because it's a document that was discussed. So you're supposed to have a copy of it somewhere, even though it's not attached to the minutes themselves. You're going to have it on the list of documents of things that was discussed. But sometimes what happens in some of the land use boards is the applicant is going to be posting the image and you may not have a copy of it. So you do want to try to get a copy of it so that you can include it in your records, but that doesn't always happen, but at least you're going to have a list of it in your meeting minutes.
I have a question online.
Yep, go ahead.
Hi. Is there guidelines of what can be used as an executive session, of what topics can be discussed in an executive session?
Yep, we're going to get to that.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. Yeah, I'm hoping to get to it. I know we have a lot to cover. Yes, sir.
So, a related question to Ariel is, if we typically at select board and many of the boards ask that presenters, if they're doing a PowerPoint or some kind of thing, they provide that ahead of time and we post it, I believe we post it with the agenda or the packet out of it. The minutes don't always, at least in my experience, reference. I say, well, Mr. Bellata from the transfer station task force presented blah, 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 and then go to discussion. But not citing specifically, like, not referencing the attachment.
Mhm.
Is it okay incorporated by reference? Just the fact that it's on the packet, it's in the packet. It's referred to, not specifically as document, but the context of it is referred to in the minutes. Do we need to go that extra step and actually identify or link that, even though it's already in the public record?
Right, so what I recommend that you do is when you have your list of the documents that was discussed at the meeting, is just have a comprehensive list that just says documents included in packet, so that somebody knows where to get those documents that were discussed at the meeting. That's really what you need it for, is to be able to find it so that somebody can have a comprehensive record of what was discussed at the meeting. All right, so yes, you will get requests for meeting minutes. One thing to keep in mind is that request is not going to be necessarily coming out of the Public Records Act. It's going to be coming under the open meeting law, and the deadlines are different for producing them. Draft minutes are public records. You can mark them as draft, but they are public records. So whether they're in final or draft form, if you get a request for them and it was an open session, then you have to produce them within 10 calendar days, as opposed to 10 business days for documents that are requested under the public record. If they are asking for executive session minutes, then you do have an obligation at that time to hold a meeting, or to the person that you may have designated to review executive session minutes, to review the executive session minutes to see if they now should be released as public records, or does the need to keep them confidential still remain. All right. I'm going to briefly go through these because you will get these slides. There are 10 reasons why you can go into the executive session. The procedure for doing so is set forth here. I'm not going to go through it all. I want you to read this, and we do also publish a card that tells you how to do the procedure to get into executive session. But as I said, first you convene an open session, you make a motion, you have to have a roll call vote to get into executive session, and all votes that are taken in executive session must be by roll call. Purpose one, this one is used a lot. So this is if you are discussing the reputation, character, physical condition, or mental health, rather than the professional competence of an individual, or to discuss discipline, dismissal, charges, or complaints. So your board, Council on Aging, has a complaint against the executive director of the council. You can go under purpose one to discuss it in executive session. There are certain notice requirements you have to give to the executive director to let her know that the board's going to be discussing charges or complaints against her. As I alluded to before, you can discuss open meeting law complaints under this purpose one. Purpose two, conducting strategy sessions. Couple of things under here. You have to identify the non-union personnel or the collective bargaining group that you are going to be discussing in executive session. It is not sufficient to just say a strategy session to discuss collective bargaining. You have to describe the union in that example. And then certain conditions of the vote, the select board, if they're going to vote on a new contract for Ryan, they have to vote on it in open session, even if they had discussed what they want to have in the new contract in executive session. But the collective bargaining agreements, you can vote to approve those in executive session. Purpose three, this comes up a lot with litigation. You're going to be in litigation. You can go into executive session to discuss it. There's some particular rules there on how you do that. The next one that gets discussed a lot is to purchase, exchange, lease, or value real property if discussing it in open session might have a detrimental effect on the negotiating position. The town's going to be offered a farm that's under chapter land. So it's been taxed at, at not full value. It's going to be sold to a developer. The select board wants to talk about whether to exercise the right of first refusal to purchase that land at the price that it's being offered to the developer. It can discuss that in executive session under purpose 6 to discuss what they're going to do. Next. Oh, this comes up a lot. Okay, if you're going to be, let's say again, the library trustee is need a new director of the library. They can set up a subcommittee. The subcommittee is going to be subject to the open meeting law, but it can meet in executive session for the purposes of doing a preliminary screening. You can have more than one meeting that constitutes the preliminary screening, but you can meet in executive session. Once you're past that preliminary screening, all the other meetings have to be in open session. COVID and remote. I think we're all really familiar with this now. We can participate remotely at the meetings. The public must be given access if certain members of the board or committee are also going to be remote. However, if all of the board is meeting in person and the public can get there, you do not have to give the public access. And that is the rule until March 31, 2025. If you're going to participate remotely, then all members of the board have to announce their name. All actions taken have to be by roll call. Everybody, including the public, has to be able to hear everybody else.
Donna, I have a question. We have had a problem with Zoom bombing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so what is like the legal, I get that you need to grant access to everybody, but like, is there any sort of, can you get your name and address, kind of, any sort of clearinghouse, kind of rule that's still legal?
Yeah, a lot of boards and committees have had that issue. There's no good answer to that. I think I've heard of a technological way to stop the Zoom bombing. Have you aware of that?
I believe it exists, and certainly
Yeah.
the courts and other government agencies are using Zoom largely without that issue at this point. So I believe it can be done, but it certainly remains an issue for those less tech savvy. Like me.
We used to say, there were certain people would do things and say, if you want to participate, if you want to observe, you contact the town clerk and she'll give you the password to get into it. That does not work because somebody needs to be able to just, at the last minute, if they decide they want to observe it, even while the meeting's ongoing, they should be able to come in late and they're not going to be able to get to the town clerk to get the password to do that. So
we've been having, so our system has been a library contact chair, which is, and we're monitoring it real time, so anyone can join last minute, but we've had 3 instances of people still saying I'd like to attend and then get in there and it's chaos.
yeah, and I suspect libraries are going to get that more and more. Libraries are quite a hot topic these days. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just not good. You can record your meetings. You have to let people know you're recording it because we are in a 2 consent state here. Meaning that if somebody doesn't want to be recorded, they have to leave. They can't tell you not to record, but you have to let everybody know that you are recording. But recording and posting it later doesn't work if you didn't give them access in real time. And you can appeal to the Division of Open Government, the Attorney General's office for an open meeting law complaints. It is not unusual for members of a board who are in the minority on that board or committee to file complaints against their own board or committee. So do be aware, they're going to know what the rules are. You want to make sure you're following the rules and you're not getting those complaints. I know I went over, so I'm going to turn this over to Ethan without asking for questions.
Sorry, remote here. One quick question on the last bullet on the prior slide.
Yeah.
About the recording being insufficient. Just to clarify, there's also no requirement to post a recording if there was a Zoom available, right?
Correct. No need to, you are not required to post the recording. We're doing which buttons? Okay. Okay.
All right, so we're gonna talk next about the public records law, and I think it's something that a lot of you will not have a ton of interaction with, but many of your boards may get email requests for records. And the first thing I'll tell you is to go to your chair, who will then go to Ryan and probably Peggy, who is your records access officer, and that may well be the last time you hear of it. And the first thing you need to know is that the public records law applies to all documents received or created by public officials or employees. And what's important to remember about this is that working as an official, either staff or an appointed or elected board member, you're gonna create a lot of public records, and some of those will be the contents of your town email address or other documents you create in that capacity. But it also reaches your personal email in the event that you've used it for public business. Same is true for text messages or social media, things like that. So it does come up when we get public records requests for someone's communications on a particular topic, that the request really reaches not only emails you sent on a government phone or through your town email, but also anything on your personal email or personal text messages, to the extent that you were conducting public business through those means. So generally the best advice is to keep it all through your public email accounts if possible. Otherwise, just to be aware that you could be open to a public records request that occasionally turns up things that you'd rather not have made public. Next. So then we do begin with the presumption that all records are public, and next slide. There are certain exemptions to what are public records, or what are public records that don't necessarily need to be produced subject to a request. And so that list, and this isn't the entire list, but it's the ones we work with most frequently. So exemption A under the public records law are things that by statute can't be released. So certain things relating to victims of domestic violence or HIPAA information, just by statute, the town can't release the records. And so if you get a request for that information, it doesn't get released. Privacy exemption works for people's personal emails, personal phone numbers, things generally that you expect will not be released to the public. There's a lot more details on that, but again, if it comes up in the request, talk to Peggy, talk to me. We'll make sure we do what we can to keep private, non-public matters out of the hands of requesters. Exemption D, the deliberative process. This is a good one, where a lot of public records for, let's say we're talking about master planning or drafting decisions for zoning boards, those sorts of things. We'll have draft decisions that, if they were released ahead of time, might sort of impair the effects of real property transactions, that sort of thing. So there are two issues here. We can't release documents that will impair the functionality of the deliberative process. So your process is secure, but sort of what are determined to be deliberative facts do get released. So if, for example, the planning board is holding a report that they're going to develop opinions from, the opinions can be held back, but the report is a public record that would be disclosed. Security, this one doesn't come up a whole lot. It touches things like building blueprints and potentially evacuation plans, things that shouldn't really be made public because it could impinge on the administration's ability to respond to emergencies, that sort of thing. Exemption O, appointed officials, unlike elected officials who sort of give up a certain degree of privacy in putting themselves in the public sphere. If you're an appointed official, your personal phone number, personal address, things that are generally collected through payroll don't have to be made public. And then tacking on to the end, anything that is subject to attorney-client privilege, we're not going to release that either. Next.
Question.
Yes.
Private notes taken by a board member during a meeting. I would heard that they, as long as they're not shared, they're exempt.
Yep, that's generally true, although it can become very fact specific. So if you're maintaining your own notes, generally speaking, those sort of process notes can be withheld as long as they're not incorporated into other public documents or sort of relied on in a meeting. So if you discuss your notes in the meeting, then they're going to become public. But if it's just, I'm taking my notes so that I can remember what happened and then reference them later, that's usually fine. As we say, just ask questions for all of these if we have any concerns. So you think you have a request, now what? As I mentioned at the beginning here, Most of you are never going to see a public records request. It'll go to the chair of a board, it'll go to Peggy or potentially another department head who's generally the person that gets contacted on these issues. So we look to see whether it's a formal request or an informal request to know how best to treat it. Example for an informal request is, can I see the building department file? You'll know very quickly if you see any of these that requesters are good at saying, this is a request under the public records law, you have 10 business days to respond. And so it's pretty obvious, but we do have to give a little bit of leeway to unexperienced people who are seeking public documents to treat most requests as though they should be treated as being subject to the law. Next. Again, just contact your records access officer with any questions. So responding to the request, you have 10 business days to respond. You can click through all these. Okay, so this covers the sort of, there might be one more.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the scope of responses here includes just providing the records. Second, identifying to the requester that there are no responsive records. So that does happen. Someone thinks they're looking for something and it just doesn't exist, and that can be okay. You can withhold the records. Click one more time, Donna. There we go. So either giving them up or not is the first two options, and then the next set of things become a little bit more complicated because it creates a right of appeal to the state supervisor of public records, which is an office within the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So you can withhold the records, but you have to identify a right to appeal. You can request additional time up to 25 business days. There's some rules for that I'll explain in a moment. You could also go back to the requester and say, can you modify the request to make it more reasonable? Or can you clarify the request so that town staff can actually understand what they're looking for? Because as you can imagine, it's not always obvious to us what the requester is seeking. And then in addition, there are certain circumstances where the town can be compensated for the time invested in searching for, collecting, reviewing, and then producing these records. And so you can provide a fee estimate. Next. So this is a good one. If there are no responsive records, it's easy to just say we don't have them. But the best thing to do is to give a little bit more context for the quality and sort of breadth of the search that was done so that the requester knows that we actually look for the records and we don't have them. This helps to avoid appeals to the supervisor's office saying, I think the town's blowing me off, basically, is what can be avoided here. Next. Okay, and so withholding a responsive record, you do have to specify what documents being withheld. And so it could be the request comes for emails from Ryan's account from Monday through Friday. And all of those emails are going to include a lot of things, right? And so some of them can be released, some of them can't. And in response to that request withholding, you have to say what is being withheld. You have to explain what the relevant exemption is for withholding it, how it applies. And then if there is an attorney-client privilege issue, there's a separate process that we don't have to address for keeping track of those documents. Next. Okay, and so requesting additional time, as I said, you can request up to 25 extra days. Peggy's probably familiar with this. And you can do that, and there's a process we can help you with for that. But the biggest thing is you have to explain why the request is so burdensome that the town needs more time. I remember years ago working on a handful of these during the pandemic, and they were requesting Board of Health records, and it was things that the town literally just could not possibly review in 10 business days while trying to respond to the pandemic. And so that was a good example of a situation where it's not that we weren't going to respond to the request, it was that we just needed more time to manage all of the municipal obligations. Next. Okay. Yeah, click through. That's good. Modification or clarification is helpful as in this example where you get a request that says all records related to or pertaining to the Cook Street development. And if you look at the example next to it, what's helpful here is that this specifies a time, it specifies an address, and really gives the town staff reviewing this request an opportunity to understand what exactly is being requested. Because if you want everything that happened on one street from the beginning of time to the present, that's going to be an incredibly expansive set of records and isn't really what the requester is probably seeking. And so in these cases, it's helpful to say, hey, we're gonna do this, but can you help us understand what you're specifically looking for, clarify what types of records? So is it emails, documents submitted, plans, building permits, that kind of thing? So that we can sort of make the process more efficient. And in that context, you can also provide a fee estimate. I mentioned that under the right circumstances, we can collect fees for the town's time in producing these kind of records. And so the first step, if we want to do that, we can provide a fee estimate to the requester saying it's going to take this number of hours at this rate for this cost. And if it's a really substantial request, sometimes the requester backs off and says, actually, I just want emails from this day, and it becomes much more manageable. Things we can request a fee estimate for is the time it takes to make redactions that are required by law or subject to attorney-client privilege. So if we get a request that COVID's a good example, there were a lot of records that included HIPAA protected information that couldn't be released. And the town had spent a lot of time reviewing those records to remove or redact that kind of material so that it wasn't inadvertently released and we didn't violate federal law. So any time spent there can be charged to the requester. And the same is true reasonably for time spent pulling files, reviewing them, copying them, and pre-filing them. In addition to that, for other requests that fall outside of those categories, we could, usually through town council, submit a request to the supervisor of public records office requesting to be allowed to charge additional fees for other records that fit under more of a discretionary redaction set. So things like privacy I mentioned, or deliberative process that are not strictly required to be withheld by statute, can nevertheless be redacted if there's a compelling reason. And with the approval of the supervisor of records, we can add those charges to a fee estimate. Next. Okay. Click one more time, Donna. Yeah. So how do we calculate the fee? I'll note the box in the top left doesn't apply to Carlisle. Towns with 20,000 or more residents have to give up the first 2 hours of search time for any request for free. So Carlisle, we're not in that boat. You get 5 cents a page for copies. You get the actual cost of production if someone's asking for large size prints or digital stuff that has to be copied to a USB drive or put in the mail. And then for the time rate that we bill, like per hour invested in this, the cap that the statute sets generally is $25 or the lowest paid person capable of performing the task. And so generally it's going to be $25. Most of the people involved in producing these records have an hourly rate higher than that. And obviously, once we've submitted a fee estimate to a requester, we get to wait for the payment, and you're not obliged to comply within the 10 days to produce the records if you're still waiting for payment. So we don't have to move forward with production until we have the money. Next. Okay, and then we talked about fee petitions. That goes to the requester, usually submitted by our office. Charges for time to make those redactions, again, that aren't required by law. You can get an increase in the hourly fee over $25 an hour if it's justified. Frequently that happens in a situation where someone's looking for sensitive records, or say like Ryan's records, and the next best person who can review his data, maybe because it's contains things that shouldn't be made public or not everybody can review, still has an hourly rate over $25 an hour. We can request to the supervisor that that $25 gets bumped up to a reasonable number that would help to compensate the town for taking up a municipal employee's time in doing this. Relief from responding, I think Carlisle doesn't get a ton of this, but there are communities out there who get multiple requests from the same person, sometimes seeking important documents, sometimes not. And if that's ever a problem, we can work with the town, work with the supervisor of public records office to try and basically say, look, this is predatory, it's repetitive, it doesn't serve a public purpose, it's not in the public interest. And we can work with you to try and mitigate that. And the same is true for additional time in the case of really complicated records requests that require a lot of review and can't be responded to within the time allowed in the statute. We're gonna pass over this one. This is more from my office. So to walk through this briefly, as I said, when you get a records request, forward it to Ryan, forward it to Peggy, we can, and then they can reach out to us if they think it's subject matter that requires extra review. The next step is either to produce the responsive records, identify that there are no records, or submit a fee estimate to the requester. From there, you could also ask for modification. If the modification is helpful in narrowing the scope of the request or identifying the documents that the requester is actually seeking, you can then again produce or not produce fee estimate or submit a fee petition, as we've discussed. Next. So a couple of good things to note. The Secretary of the Commonwealth's Office for Public Records has a great public records law guide that's available in PDF online. Has a lot of detail. The first 10 or 20 pages or so run through all these exemptions. If anybody is interested and has a desire to look through that, it's very helpful. One of the things that it highlights is a very strong preference under the current interpretation of the law to provide access to electronic copies of records where they're available. So that's not, I want emails from Peggy's account for Monday through Friday and you print them and then mail them. It's PDF searchable electric copies sent by email, if that's possible. And that helps everybody, right? Because Peggy doesn't have to spend time printing and copying and scanning all of her emails. It's a lot easier. And then should these records be online? So again, there's a preference in the law to make regularly requested documents available online. So I'm trying to think of a couple good examples, but generally like planning board and zoning board decisions where the public is going to be interested in the substance of them, those frequently get posted online. The same is true. I guess meeting minutes probably have to be posted online, but
They are.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
good example. And I haven't seen it done recently, but the supervisor's office, if they think the town should be posting something that is really a public matter, will occasionally offer those comments if an appeal gets filed. Next. Okay, so as I mentioned, for pretty much any category of response other than producing the records or stating that they don't exist, you have to acknowledge in your response that there is a right to appeal, which goes in the first instance to the supervisor of public records. If the appealing party doesn't like the answer they get from the supervisor, you can take it to the Superior Court. Yeah, we can skip over this.
I wanted to get back to on the Zoom bombing question.
Yes.
One thing that's has worked is if you're on Zoom, you have the host mutes everybody who attends. And then you only unmute people when they are being called upon to speak. So somebody has to raise their hand, then they're unmuted. And then once they stop, they're muted again. And if somebody is a Zoom bomber, you mute them. So that's what I would recommend. Yes, sir.
Hi, that reminds me of another question that's come up. So if in the old days of all in-person meetings, there are times for public comment and there are times for no, most of the meeting, not for public. So people can raise their hand physically and the chair may recognize them, but no reason to. In the Zoom times, we've had sort of open chat. And people are making all kinds of comments on the chat. And I thought we could disable that, but I think we had a conversation about you can't, or you're not allowed to, I mean, you can't technically, but. So what is the position of the chat? So the raising the hand, I get. Right?
Yeah, yeah. So the law
On-
hasn't
on
changed.
Open loop of chat, you get all these kind of comments that they would never be allowed to read and know.
Right. I'm not aware technologically as to whether you can
And you
shut
can-
down
you can
chat.
say-
Oh, you can disable it.
But there was some question about whether we're allowed.
Oh, yes. No, the rule hasn't changed. If it's not a public hearing, then the public has no right to speak.
Does
So
that extend to the chat?
that extends to the chat. So
You can disable.
you can disable it so long as it's not a public hearing.
Right.
So that's the distinction again between an open session in which the public just has the right to observe.
Yeah.
They do not have a right to participate.
Right, you should say for people who don't know, I think, something along the lines of, and this often we will say this to people. A public meeting is a meeting held in public. It is not.
Right,
It is not a meeting by the public.
right. That's why I try to stay away from calling it a public meeting, because then people start thinking of public hearing. and start thinking they have the right to participate. So I think of it instead as an open session, meaning that the public has the right to observe. Executive session, they do not.
One additional point on the Zoom chat, I think, as a policy matter, it should either be enabled or disabled
I agree.
throughout the entire meeting. I think I've occasionally seen questions from clients about, can we disable it or shut it down if there's disrespectful things happening in the chat? And the answer really is it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be silencing commentary in response to its content. That raises some pretty serious First Amendment questions. And so if it's open for a meeting, it should stay open.
It's only a personal opinion. My recommendation is that we adopt the policy of disabling chat. The reason I say that, is again, that we would not allow note passing, placard holding, whispering during a meeting, and say, and so I think consistency on the Zoom side with the physical meeting side would be during the time of public comment, you can raise your hand and be recognized. You can also raise your hand in the middle of the meeting and share it, his or her discretion. Okay?
Right.
Recognize the person, but this sidebar that goes on is really quite distracting, and it's unfair because the people who are in the meeting physically don't have that. So that's my personal opinion, but
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to take it up.
I just want to piggyback on the chat, and then you can also have private chats. And
Right.
if you are two people on the same committee, don't do it, because that's the same as deliberating and being up, again,
And the issue of texting,
and texting.
because that's come up as well, where one member of the board will text another member of the
During
board
a meeting. sometimes,
during a
yes.
meeting. That has come up as an open meeting law complaint. The AG has said if it's less than a quorum, it's not going to be a violation, but they really don't recommend it.
Quick question,
Yes.
If we hold a committee meeting, it's, notice to the public and you have members of the public that are joining. Is there an affirmative obligation that they get to speak?
No,
Okay.
unless it's a public hearing
Okay.
or during the public comment period. And I'll tell you, your board or committee does not need to offer a public comment period. So, a lot of boards and committees got into the habit of setting aside the first 10 minutes of the meeting to say somebody can come and they can talk about anything that they want. You do not have to offer that under the law. And it has certainly burned some boards and committees that have done that. So if you're going to offer that, be pretty careful. Maybe you want to say it's going to have to be on a matter that is within the jurisdiction of the board or committee. We're not going to let you to get up there and talk about the war in Ukraine, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly state that I have been involved in federal government. And there were Zoom methodologies, this was prior to Zoom. But for public meetings, what they did was essentially disable the public comment, the chat portion.
Right.
During the period when they are not accepting public comments, then it would, but it would then be closed at the end of the public commentary period. I do not know if there's a way to enable that functionality.
Yeah, technically you can do it. I'm just saying, people can raise it.
Bearings.
That's right, but that was mostly on the chat. Well, but my point is more that and a level playing field for those who attend in person. and Those who attend remotely. Just even doing what you're saying gives an advantage, so to speak.
So we can see this.
The remote participant to type in whatever he or she wants. Whereas if you have to patiently raise your hand, you have to wait. And so for the variety of reasons.
I understand, but the organizers of the committee, the leaders of the committee, or the chair of whoever was organizing the committee would specifically state there are issues in the chat, okay? And we are going to address this specific one now from this specific participant who would be named. They wouldn't answer any comments, respond to any comments from anonymous participants. Hey,
So I'd like to scare everyone and then make you feel better. So, before I left the previous town I was employed with, we got a records request from a woman who was agreed by the police department. Fast forward 2 years later, what happened was every time that the board went into executive session, she requested those minutes and they had to keep going and keep going into executive session in an endless loop, and it was intentional. $45,000 later, the town is still dealing with the records requests. So you can get into a lot of trouble with records and OML, but it's really rare. So the way we help you combat that, and this is what I would like you to take away from this meeting, is if you have any questions about what you're doing with open meeting law, if you have any questions about the agenda, or I'd like to do this type of deliberation and action, or someone's asked for this record, we're not the enemy in that situation. We're not the police. We are here to help you interpret the law and make sure as volunteers, you're not getting hemmed up in some $45,000 lawsuit about records because someone's agreed. So please reach out. Peggy's an absolute subject matter expert in all of these things. Aubrey and I deal with these, and then our town council, despite my very bad joke in the beginning, are really responsive and can get you answered. So before you do something, if you ask, then we can get you the right answer, and then you get to decide whether or not you do it. And that, just to echo a point, most of the open meeting law stuff that we deal with is board on board or board to board crime. Okay, so it is your peers and your other board members that are more likely to be mad that you were deliberating or not doing something than it is a member of the public. So again, ask questions or use your chair to ask questions of us. We can help you. And a lot of the times it's just a mitigation of between two people that we perform just to keep it on the up and up.
One last point on what needs to be in the agendas. I had talked about the agenda has to include everything that the chair thinks reasonably expects to be reached and have it in more than 48 hours in advance or 48 hours in advance. The AG's office does accept as not an open meeting law violation talking about something that came up within that 48 hours. They recommend that if that happens, if you really need to discuss it at that meeting, amend your agenda as soon as you can, even though it's within the 48 hours. But if you can postpone it to a later meeting, that is the preferred response to a late topic.
I think somebody on Zoom, Karen, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I have a question about the executive session, and I guess I'll reach out to Peggy then. I think that's the recommendation, right? To reach out to Peggy about these questions. Okay.
Sure.
My comment on yours is just as a guideline that those chairs setting the agenda should probably err on the side of packing the agenda, even if you might not reach everything, because if it's on the agenda and you run out of time and you don't cover it, you can just roll it to the next agenda. Whereas if it's not on the agenda and you have extra time, do that.
Yeah, absolutely. The agenda items, you don't, just because it's on the agenda doesn't mean you need to discuss it at the meeting. You can always pass it over. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's better to put it on if you have a question.
One additional comment to keep in mind on that point is that, and it doesn't happen a lot in Carlisle, but if you use an agenda that has times for specific things to occur, if you have something that's going to happen at 6:30 or 7:30, you can't reach that agenda item before the time specified on the agenda because the public expecting it to happen at that time needs to be able to attend. So certainly if you have one of those packed agendas and you're skipping over things, you have to be wary that it's not acceptable to reach things early when you specify a time for the matter to be discussed.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thanks all. That was a lot of information that just came. So I will be sending the PowerPoint after, and also this recording. I know a lot of folks who couldn't make it tonight, asked for this recording, so I will send that as well. So we wanted to touch base a little bit on managing public comments. As you know, and recently there's been a lot of changes that you can't just stop somebody from talking for the sake because you just don't agree with them. MMA is the Massachusetts Municipal Association, and they just recently released some guidelines that we can look into, and we'll be working on, setting a policy, but these are kind of the samples that they provided on best practices for public comment. And so it's good to keep in mind. And so as Myers Harrison just mentioned, you don't have to offer public comment portion on your agenda. Unfortunately, I think that's just going to happen more and more now that people don't want, to be berated publicly. But if you do, you can, set some parameters to try to keep it as civil as possible. So the chair is responsible for conducting these public meetings, making sure they remain civil. You can allow it, you don't have to. You can put in time limits, so it could be 10 minutes tops. It could be 2 to 3 minutes per person. So that also limits if somebody's trying to ramble on and on. You can only speak with, or the public will only speak with permission, and identify themselves, their name and their street. And the matters that public member brings up will not be debated or acted upon by the time that they're presented. It's on the agenda. And the speakers must conduct themselves in a peaceable and orderly manner, which, to be careful what that might mean. But obviously if they're screaming at you, threatening any violence, that's obviously reason to stop that. Like that, no true threats of violence or incite imminent lawless conduct by others. And encourage to refrain from acts that disrupt or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any meeting. And you can't disrupt proceedings of a meeting. The chair can authorize the removal of a person from a meeting. So if they keep being disruptive, they do have that ability. And the same applies to remote participation. We just had a great conversation about adding chat that can get out of hand and unruly. So it's good to hear that we don't have to allow chat throughout the meeting. But as with all of this, with the new, so you have to make sure that you are protecting free speech. So, just because you don't like somebody disagreeing with you or not liking you, you can't stop them from speaking. It's more a matter of the matter of how they are presenting themselves that you can limit. And by the best thing to do is just to limit that time. And that's the best way to go about it. Any questions? I know that used to be, you would just shut people down, and they've said now you can't just do it like that, and you can't single anybody out. So you have to really be careful with that. Ryan, did you want to mention anything?
On this,
Public comments, yeah.
it won't be a problem for you until it is.
Yeah.
Then you'll want to, this is a problem for staff as well, so sorry. First Amendment auditors and other issues, right? So what we do is very public. We have very public jobs, and it's a constant debate about how public everything is. Can you look at my computer screen and come in as I'm typing? Versus is everything on my desk public? If my phone's open, you can look at it. So these are pretty serious debates going on all around the country. In Massachusetts is home to some smart people. So it's fun. It's fun to be a staff and volunteer. So thank you for doing it.
So I'm gonna bring this to Peggy. If you want to talk a little bit about just, what these people have all technically gone through this, but if you want to just remind them of what that looks like when they start and what they need to remember, keep in mind.
Well, Sid got a great list of everything that, the materials that we hand out when you're appointed and then become sworn in, so that you get the handbook of all of the open meeting law. I think it's like a 95-page document that we send off to you. Important again that you be sworn in before attending any meetings, or you can attend a meeting, but you can't vote at a meeting until you've been sworn in. we, do ask that you follow the agendas and minutes, style guide. Many of you have had agendas and minutes, pushed back because you haven't done things the way that we want to see. Especially, things that help, the public with what they're viewing. I mean, something as simple, honestly, as page numbers are very helpful to people in the printed. That's why it's there. We've got plenty of links to the state rules and regulations. And if there's any questions that you have, after even, been a board member for a long time and you're still kind of unclear about certain things, we're there to help you with that stuff. If we don't have the answer, we go to Ryan or we go to town council for you to be able, because Ryan says it best, we're here to help you. We're not here to be your enemy. We're trying to help you get it done. And we're trying to make sure that you're covered so that you don't get any complaints filed with the Attorney General's office. So if you have any questions, see me, call me, or email me.
Thank you.
So this doesn't apply to all the boards and committees, but some of you have a staff member that you manage, and so I think it's important to know what the process looks like. Staff knows that all the staff know now that we are setting goals and evaluations formally for everybody. Their step increases will be tied to that. So if they meet goals, then they'll just get that for the next year. So that's been a really big change that's been coming up, but it's in the personnel policy, so it's great to be following that. And then one of the things that really matters for boards and committees is employee turnover. So what do you do if your staff person does leave? Well, first you can reach out to me. So my position is new, as most of you know, so I can help manage that process. And so I could work with an exit interview with them. And then I would reach out to that board on the hiring process. So I would help manage, and we'd also create a smaller hiring committee. I would definitely recommend at least one person from the board be part of that. And then if they are the appointing authority, then we move forward in having them vet and appoint them. And then I would manage the onboarding and making sure that they're all ready and set to go. So trying to make sure that this is more formalized, we're doing the processes correctly, and also making sure that volunteers aren't having to manage all of this from the beginning to end. So, so if there's any questions, any issues, feel free to email me. I'll make sure that everybody's email addresses are included when I forward this PowerPoint. So I'd leave it to Jen to just talk about what to do. Or I can do it if you want. I can do it. So what Jen Gibbons, as most of you know, she represents the select board. She's the executive assistant to them. So you would reach out to her or anybody that's interested in being appointed. So an interested candidate would submit a letter of interest and meet, and that board would meet with the candidates. And then that board would recommend to the select board for approval and appointment. So it's a pretty easy process, but just making sure that we follow that step. If anybody resigns, the member submits a letter of resignation to the town clerk, who then sends it to the select board and the chair of the board or committee. And then the town clerk must receive the resignation letter for the resignation to be deemed effective. So making sure that that is formally done, so then we can start again with the process. Jen and I are also working on making sure that we are announcing any vacancies. So if there's any of those, make sure that we can know, and I can help with the putting on a social media newsletter. We work with town clerk's office on the website, and Jen also has it announced with the select board, and making sure that people are aware of what's available. Any questions on processes?
I have a question about protocol, and
Mhm.
please don't read into this. This has not come up. It's just a question. If there are some vacancies in a committee And there is a person who applies for one of the vacancies, but the committee feels that it's really not a good fit.
Mhm.
What are the protocols? And again, this has not come up, but I want to be clear about that. But what are the protocols for that?
So that's a great question. So one of the things that Aubrey and I have identified, and if you don't agree with me, then please don't let me speak for you. Is with vacancies with boards and committees. So sometimes we get through Jen, myself and Aubrey, here are the people that we want on this board, right? So the only advice we have to you there is you're not getting a diversity of opinion or a chance for a diversity on your boards if other people didn't know that it was open. So we are suggesting that vacancies act almost like a ticket. So I have a vacancy that goes to Jen. Jen then executes a process where we advertise a position. That position then goes to the board for a recommendation. And here is the answer to your question is if you don't feel like it's a good fit, it is the select board's appointment in most cases. But you could give a recommendation saying, we don't think this person's a good fit. Sometimes that's because, you know, they may not be interested or intentionally trying to join your board for some reason, but it should be publicly debated, these positions. The biggest complaint we get, and it's not necessarily public, is the homogeneous nature of boards, the inability of boards to get new ideas or volunteers. And then most people don't consider that until there's a massive turnover. And people, like, how do we fill this? We've had the people here for a long time have been effective, and in many cases, it's not a problem until it is. So you should consider how you fill your vacancies. I know the select board is discussing this as part of their goals of how to make the process more open and fair. There are a ton of people in town who want to volunteer for something, and they just say, I'd like to volunteer, and they just kind of slip through the cracks because they weren't specifically recruited for a position. And that's no good. We want the talent of the whole town participating in the town's voting process.
I just want to add one thing to that also, though. One of the things that we're looking for from our volunteers is a real commitment to the volunteer position, that you can't just kind of, you know, decide to come this meeting and not to that meeting. It's not fair to the other volunteers. So, and that goes for our elected boards as well. You know, the staff and the boards need to be able to have their quora, because we've had problems in the past where we just could never get the meeting, the board or the committee to meet, and then the work didn't get done, and that left us vulnerable because there were functions in town that just weren't getting fulfilled. So if you are if you are yourself a volunteer, or if you're vetting volunteers, I would certainly ask you to ask those volunteers for a real definite commitment.
Going back to what you said earlier, if a select board appointed committee hasn't opened, and there's a request probably made for volunteers, they send a letter of interest to the relevant board and committee chair or to the select. Who do they? How do they express their interest?
You know what I'm gonna say, David? Let up to you.
No, I know that, but then if people will buy the, we send it, say it's sustainability. Does it go to you then?
We've had actually interest, though, some people to Jen and some people directly to us.
Where does it end up? All at you?
And then Jen.
Right, so can that committee simply not pass on the recommendation that that committee was not dealing with that particular applicant is suitable?
They can, and the detailed question is the ESC is a creation of the select board, so the select board decides how its membership is filled.
Right, but we may never know. I mean, that's what I'm asking. But
We would like to know, because the board, maybe they wouldn't, you know, maybe you wouldn't recommend them for your committee, but we would like to know that they've
So this-
volunteered.
It's the case that I have to shut this down, this three select board members.
so it's down.
Except in trainings, as I understand, trainings are exempt.
But we are varying into.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that's just for the, so we don't put these people more. Are you saying there is no standard policy present?
Yeah. We will work on it.
And I don't believe it.
Because clearly we need one.
Any-
So if you can take something from our presentation, it's to let us know that you have a vacancy and we'll help you fill it. And we'll work with you to decide how you want to fill it as boards and committees within the purview of the law. But sometimes boards and committees just wait. They don't tell us, and then they have quorum problems or other issues where they disband. We don't want that either. So.
So we're just gonna touch on finance real quick. This is the last one. I'm speaking on behalf of the finance department, so I'll try to translate it as best as I can as well. My biggest thing is if you have any issues, I will also put in the town accountant's contact information, so she can either help you or direct you to the right person. So a lot of boards and committees manage invoices. So make sure you utilize the sales tax exemption. I would talk to Kelly about how to make that happen. So then you're not getting sales tax, because if you're just looking for a reimbursement, there's a good chance you can't get your tax reimbursed. And then if there is a vendor that already has an account with the town, make sure that you are leaving your name and or committee name on that invoice for the order, because recently we had buckwheat hulls ordered, as you all probably got an email about. And we still are trying to figure out who ordered them under the town of Carlisle. It's a very specific order. Buckwheat hulls, I'm not even sure.
We have an invoice that we don't know.
Yeah, I had to Google what that was. And so another unique thing with municipalities is you have to make sure that the services were performed or provided before you pay. That's a little different than other industries. And then you make sure that it's signed by a committee member before you submit it to the accounting office. So making sure that's all set so they don't have to follow up with you. And then make sure that that person who's signing is designated at a meeting. And then also, if your committee has more than one account, make sure you're specifying which account it's going into. So basically, the accounting office just needs to know, what is this? Where is it going to? Who authorized it? And so they have that information, because we are audited. And then last, be aware of your budget and available funds. So making sure that if you have an employee that works for your commission or board or committee, that they are not going over what their allotted amount is. Same with just any sort of purchasing power you have. Make sure, and if you need to know what that balance is, Kelly can help with that. And then for anybody who manages turnovers, making sure that any volunteer that collects money fills out a turnover sheet and triplicate. So one for the treasurer, one for the accountant, and one for your own committee. And then the money needs to be turned in no less than once a month, and large amounts should be weekly or bi-weekly. Sure.
What constitutes a large amount?
That's something I can look into for you. What that means to the finance office, I'll find out. For existing accounts, the treasurer's office can assist with the turnover sheet. Any new purpose funds collected need to be discussed with the accountant for a new account to be set up. So you can't just send money, just, it goes wherever, making sure that we have exactly where it needs to go. So any questions on that?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
So on the organization chart,
Mhm.
youth commission sort of went in two directions. It went for state and it went to the select board.
Mhm.
So for budget, expenses, especially with vendors where we, work with TJ or things of that sort, should we sit with the select board to review that budget, or should we sit with the town finance office? Because I'm unclear about where the grant, like,
Sure.
you know what I mean, where the budget comes from, like,
Yeah.
who we apply to for extra funding for projects.
So that would be the finance office. They can definitely work with you on where it goes. So then when you have future expenses, you know exactly
Okay,
what to do. And you can always just check in with them and ask. And
Okay.
they're really responsive. So.
great. And then do we ask,
You are
like,
appointed by the select board because of Mass General Law. You are not a state creature.
okay, so that's why there was like the.
I use creature for boards and committees, not for humans. Sorry, what you said.
Oh, no, it's, I just, because of the two arrows, it's like, okay, if we have, something that comes up, we are looking for whatever, a different spending procedures.
Mhm.
Just trying to figure out which direction to be going to ask for permission, I guess, I'm not raising this properly.
You are, so, and it's
Yeah.
confusing, so here's what you should know, if you have a budget, then you are responsible for your budget, unless you have delegated that, or it's under the purview of the select board, which are two big exceptions. So, you have to ask town meeting to approve your budget, and the voters say that you can have that money, you are not to exceed that money. Because town meeting has said you only get this much, you have all of it if you want, but only that much. If you go over, then you're violating state law. Grants have to be, and donations have to be accepted by the town, so even if you get a grant or donation, it still needs to come through the finance office for vetting, because if we commit to a match, you don't have the money or other funds to make sure that that's good. And lastly, all expenditures from the town are approved by the select board and also by me for procurement, and I just want to talk about procurement real quick. So if you commit to a contract or a dollar amount that exceeds the state threshold for procurement, then when we get audited, you will likely get a note saying that you violated state finance law, and the town's credit rating can literally be at risk because of that. So some numbers to remember: if you're spending more than $10,000, which is very rare for boards and committees, it's pretty large, then really, if you're spending any large sum, you should be talking to me about it so that we can help you procure it correctly. So this is the thing I get the most often. We have a contract, it's for $9,999, and we've used Jane Smith forever for this service. So we're just gonna redo that and sign a 3-year contract, which is actually a $30,000 contract, which means it needs to be bid. And even if Jane is the most perfect person to do this job, state law does not allow us to give a contract or public funds to that person without going through a procurement process. Don't expect you to remember all that. What I expect you to remember is, if you are in charge of money, it's a big deal, and we're here to help you. Make sure that you don't break any and violate any laws. And the second thing, just on this slide and the previous one, I am in charge of finance on behalf of the select board. Kelly, who's our town accountant, is a lovely person and very nice, but I expect her to be an absolute wall for public finance. So if she's giving you a hard time, it's because she has to. Otherwise, things like fraud and other things that show up in the newspaper happen in your community, and you don't want that. Same thing with our treasurer. So we're not trying to be difficult, we're trying to keep the town out of trouble. We always try to figure out how we can help you get out of any problem, so we'd rather know than not. But I do expect my finance staff to be absolutely rigid with state law, and then we'll figure it out. So usually you get a rejection first, and then I come and I'm like, hey, let's talk about it.
So what I think is, budgets are approved at town meeting, they usually don't get down to the level of the particular board or committee, but the board or committee understands that comment, whether they have certain. What signing authority do board and committee members have typically to encumber the town? Again, below the 10,000, let's say not that, but other purchase orders, contracts, is there rules on that?
Yes, all of the same rules apply.
Which is what, if I'm a chairman of the rec,
Then you have signing authority for everything up to your budget. But you still have to follow all the procurement laws.
Right.
Every warrant is still reviewed by the select board. And me.
well, I can sign a contract if it's less than 10,000. If it's in my budget and less than
Yes.
10,000, I can sign the contract out of the town, obligation.
Okay. Pretty scary.
That's,
So the last thing I want to talk about finance. So if you have an employee, then there are some things about finance that are not generally believed to be finance. So if your employee accrues paid time off, or is up for, resigns or is up for retirement, there are financial obligations that you incur. So the management of an employee's time and accruals is a fraud level offense if it is signed incorrectly. So we have boards and committees who are appointing authorities, and they are the signatory for that employee. So by signing a timesheet for an employee, you are saying that person has said what they said on this timesheet, and we are affirming that with my signature. So many boards and committees like a little help with that, because they may or may not manage their employees and others do not. So, that signature part is probably the town's greatest liability. We have worked to work through approval process, another process to make sure that there's more insight and more transparency to that. But I'm talking to you about that, it's for a reason. I'm trying to keep people from getting out of trouble. I don't really care if your employee takes time off or not. In fact, I encourage it. I just want to make sure we know how much time off they're going to have, because again, it's not an issue until they retire and they tell you they have 400 hours. And now we have to go to town meeting and say, this board didn't track that time and now we owe it. I wish I could end with something more fun. I just did.
Vacation.
So how many people are new?